Hello and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And just want to give you all a quick reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization is donor supported. Please go to justandsinner.org, go to our donate page, and help us out with everything that we do so we can continue to produce the materials and the materials that we're able to give out for free, as well as keeping our books at a low cost. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means any gifts that you give us are tax deductible. So today we are going to be continuing our Makers of the Modern World series. And we've been dealing with more recent thinkers, largely looking at the 20th century. And I've decided to take a bit of a step back in this series to start talking about some of the earlier thinkers that are highly influential in modern philosophy, who are really essential to understand, to get a grasp, a real understanding of the developments of various ideas in the modern world. So there are a couple of major figures that you really have to grasp to understand movements within the 20th century in philosophy. And we're not just talking about philosophy here, because philosophy affects all sorts of different areas. So philosophy, theology, the arts, sociology, psychology, politics, nearly every area is affected by some of the conclusions of philosophy. But the two major figures that we really need to talk about more than perhaps anybody else are Immanuel Kant and then Hegel as well. So we'll definitely do something on Hegel. And then we may even take a step back and look at René Descartes, who was known as the founder of modern philosophy, who really sets up a lot of the problems that we see then being answered by various philosophers and thinkers throughout the centuries, like Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant is really the central figure of the Enlightenment. And he's not at the very beginning of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a movement that is associated with figures prior to him. But in many ways, Kant is really the culmination of Enlightenment thought. And we see within Kant an attempt to synthesize a lot of different movements that have been going on in philosophy since the writings of René Descartes. And nearly everyone in philosophy or theology in some way who is writing today is influenced by Immanuel Kant. You know, for better or worse, he is a major figure, if not kind of the major figure of modern philosophy that everybody has to grapple with and wrestle with. He creates a lot of the categories that people simply think in popular thought. So we're going to explore the ideas of Immanuel Kant. We're going to start, as we do in this series, with just some details about his life. So he is born in 1724 in Eastern Prussia. So he is German. His family is very religiously devout. They are Lutheran pietists. Now, just to give you a brief overview and understanding of what's going on within German theology and German religion, because this does, I think, significantly inform a lot of Kant's ideas in the way that he thinks about the world. We can kind of roughly divide up Lutheran history at this time in Germany in terms of centuries. Now, this is a rough estimation, so the dates aren't exact, but the 16th century is generally the time of the Reformation. So 1517, Luther nails the 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg, and then this has a massive impact upon Western Europe as the Lutheran Church is founded, and the Roman Catholic Church excommunicates Luther, and thereby the Lutheran movement. 1530, the Augsburg Confession is presented defining Lutheran thought, and then in 1580 we have the completion of the Book of Concord defining the beliefs of the Lutheran Church. So we have this era of confessionalization in the 16th century, the beginnings of the Reformation, and then the defining of what Reformation theology is. And then when we get into the next 100 years, the 17th century is largely the era of scholasticism within Protestantism. And so this is the era where theologians are defining what they believe very particularly. They're working out a detailed and comprehensive system of thought from the Reformation changes in theology and from a uniquely Protestant perspective, but they're also doing that while incorporating the earlier church teachings of the Church Fathers and medieval synthesis as well, dealing with questions of how faith relates to philosophy. So it's a very much an academic era in the development of Protestant theology broadly, but here we're talking about Lutheranism in Germany. But there is a movement, and if you're not familiar with the movement, known as Pietism, that arises toward the end of that century. And Pietism it's a multifaceted movement, and there are many different groups of pietists that believe different things. But in general, the Pietist movement is a reaction to what is perceived to be a kind of dead orthodoxy. And that's at least the language that's used to refer to the era of Protestant scholasticism, Lutheran orthodoxy in particular. So the Pietists thought that some of Lutheran orthodoxy had been so dry, focused on particularities of intellectual assent to various doctrines, and this affected the average congregation because it was feared that sermons were more theological lectures than they were actually anything practically, affecting the people in the congregation. So the Pietists argued for the necessity of personal conversion and emphasized the internal work of the Spirit in regeneration rather than a doctrinal proposition. Now, there are different kinds of pietists. There are Orthodox pietists who are very firm on Orthodox theology, but also have the kind of experiential element of the pietists and the emphasis on conversion and personal faith. But there are others who are certainly less Orthodox. You have the radical pietists, and those groups tend to be skeptical of any kind of clericalism at all, and they are skeptical of anything that is too academic in its theology or in its theological construction. And the Pietists very much start to focus on inward faith and inward experiences of faith. And this is important to know because I think some of this is going to have an impact on how Kant views his philosophy. So his family were devout Lutheran pietists. They were very devout Christians, very devout Lutherans, and they would have emphasized internal conversion experiences over a systematizing of theological concepts. Kant studies at the University of Königsberg. He gets there in 1740, and while he is there, he studies a number of different subjects, but he has an emphasis on philosophy, particularly metaphysics. He studies under the rationalist thinker Martin Knudsen, who is a professor, he's an associate professor of metaphysics and logic. Now, as he is here studying his theological ideas, right, his theological concepts, his pietist Christianity is challenged in a lot of ways by rationalism. And rationalism has now, and we'll talk a little more about who the rationalists are, but rationalism is a movement that is starting to grow rather significantly within philosophy. So you have a focus on that which can be proven by means of reason rather than supernatural revelation. And so when you get into the Middle Ages and then the Protestant scholastics of the 17th century, there is an attempt to synthesize faith and reason in the scholastic synthesis to say there are some things that are known via reason, natural law, the existence of God, some of the attributes of God, and there are other things that are only known through supernatural revelation. And so those are the things that are revealed in Scripture, and if you're Roman Catholic, you're going to say also within church tradition. So there is a synthesis of faith and reason, both kind of going hand in hand. Faith is good, reason is good, natural revelation and supernatural revelation are both good, and they both work together. And that is going to be challenged by the rationalists, who argue against taking supernatural revelation as authority and instead prioritizing that which can be proven via logical construction or what can be seen and observed in the world. We'll talk about the difference between the rationalists and the empiricists. But we see Kant is challenged at this time by the rationalists. And so he has these two influences upon his thought, which are going to be key. One is his Lutheran pietism, and then the other is the rationalism that he is trained in here. He eventually becomes a tutor and lecturer at Königsberg, where he remains until his death in 1804. So he stays there his whole life. And we see this with Kant, and I have a point here that he lives a highly organized routine life. Something that's very often mentioned when people talk about Kant's biography is that his neighbors measured the time of day by when Kant went on his regular walk. So we see in Kant, and you see this in his writings as well, he's a very systematic man. He's very organized. He's very particular about how he does things. And so he goes for the same walk every day in the same places. He lives in the same place his whole life. And so, you probably know people like this, and maybe you're like this. You're just very routine. That's the kind of person that Kant was. Now, that doesn't mean that he, was isolated. He was not just an individual who just did things on his own. He was actually relatively social as well. So he had friendships. He wasn't you kind of picture a figure like Kant as being kind of hauled up just in his office all the time by himself or something, but he was actually quite social. Now, he published really extensively throughout his life, and Kant is a figure he's one of the philosophical figures throughout history who was able to have an impact on nearly every single field. So through his Critique of Pure Reason, he has, which is probably his most influential book, though his books are influential in various areas. He has an influence on epistemology, or the study of knowledge, as well as metaphysics, the first things of philosophy, the study of things like being or ontology, what exists. And then he later writes on, the metaphysics of morals, and his moral philosophy becomes a dominant moral philosophy, if not the dominant moral philosophy of his time. He writes on aesthetic theory, and if you read contemporary philosophical aesthetics, everyone still deals with Kant. There are plenty of strong devotees to Kant's approach to aesthetics today. He also writes a religious philosophy. He writes a book called Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone. At least that's one translation of it. It's published under similar but different titles. And that book has a profound impact upon the rise, really the birth of Protestant liberalism and the rise of Protestant liberalism. So his views on everything from, metaphysics to epistemology to ethics to aesthetics, theology, and politics. And I didn't even mention his politics, and I'm not going to mention his politics too much here, but even the concept of the United Nations has its roots in some of the writings of Kant. Kant also is the first person to suggest that we could talk about subjects not as just individual person, but collective groups of people, which then is going to be developed through Hegel and also via Hegel in Marx. So nearly every aspect of modern life is touched in some way by Immanuel Kant. And kind of the ironic thing is Kant, when he first wrote his Critique of Pure Reason, it was largely criticized. It was not seen to be some kind of groundbreaking work when it was first released. It actually took a bit of time for his writings to have much of an influence at all. And we see this in a lot of major philosophers, that they don't necessarily have the big impact they expect to immediately, and it takes some time. So he is influential within his own lifetime, but at the beginnings of his publications, he is not seen as a particularly important thinker. But he ends up being the most important thinker of his age by far. So let's talk about kind of the philosophical background and ideological more broadly, but some of the ideas that are showing up at this time. Because Kant is addressing a lot of the movements of his day. He's answering a lot of the questions that people have of his time. So this background is important to understand what exactly Kant is speaking to. So the first thing that's really essential to understand Kant and the philosophy of this time in general is the rise of Newtonian physics. Now, Newtonian physics was particularly important in the way that it spoke about causes in the material world. And through Newtonian physics, people began to understand the regularity of creation, the fact that the physical world follows pretty particular laws, and it does those very regularly. And this results in a shifting toward what's called a mechanistic view of nature. Now, a mechanistic view of nature is one that says that the natural world is basically like a machine. It's a machine that just runs. It just does what it does, and all of the material pieces do what they do. And the natural world is basically like that. So questions of teleology, meaning questions of purpose, are taken away from discussions of nature. So when you look at a more ancient view in someone like Aristotle, and then what's true in the medieval period, as well as post-Protestant Reformation, is a teleological view of nature, a view that says that the natural world has purposes bound within it. And we cannot understand the natural world without understanding it from the perspective of purposes that exist within things. And of course, when you're speaking about a divine creator, God himself has created things with actual purposes and functions. But now you see a move from that approach to one that sees it really as something like a mechanical, just series of mechanical processes. And this is going to lead to a bunch of questions that philosophers have, because if everything is essentially machine, what does this do with human freedom? What does this do with the human will? Do we have any say in anything that's happening, or are we just mere machines like everything else in nature? And freedom is a mere illusion. And so that problem is going to be one that Kant is going to face, and modern philosophers are still very much working out the implications of that. There is a rising skepticism, and rising skepticism in terms of what had been inherited in the past. So rising skepticism of classical philosophy, and it is often seen that Newtonian physics and the modern developments in our scientific understanding of the world have meant that we can now kind of throw out, the Platos and the Aristotles of the world. They very much dependent upon kind of outdated views of how the natural world works, which to some extent is true in that especially Aristotle had particular views of how the natural world functions, because at the time of the ancient Greeks, philosophy and science and theology are all kind of one discipline. They're not divided very strongly. So there are scientific conclusions that certainly are proven to be wrong. Of course, the basic metaphysical questions, I would argue that you see in Plato and Aristotle, are fundamentally different than their observations about the natural world. And so even if we have moved into greater understandings of the natural world, it doesn't disprove their metaphysical conclusions, which are not dependent upon their particular views of science per se. But nonetheless, there's skepticism of classical approaches to philosophy, skepticism of metaphysics altogether. There is skepticism of classical religious claims. And so Kant is wrestling with this skepticism, and he himself is dealing with skepticism and doubt himself as he moves into a rationalist framework in his younger career. And then there's going to be a break at some point, which we'll talk about. So something else that's important to keep in mind is the two major schools of philosophical thought at this time in modern philosophy. And that is a divide between rationalism and empiricism. Now, the strict divide between these two movements is one that actually comes later from philosophers looking back on this era and dividing them into these categories. So they're not categories these philosophers would have strictly put themselves in, but I think the division remains pretty helpful to show what are some of the major strains in philosophy that are occurring at this time. And I almost say theology, but actually they're relatively connected at most points. So first we have the movement that we describe as rationalism. And this is the major movement on the continent. So Britain, things are developing a little bit differently than they are in the West, the rest of Western Europe at the time. So rationalism on the continent, we have Baruch Spinoza, who is a pretty fascinating Jewish philosophical thinker. And then we have Leibniz as well as two major examples. And they're really developing what begins in Descartes. And in many ways, everybody's kind of developing what begins in Descartes. And Descartes, to just summarize maybe what's most significant about Descartes with the rise of these movements is that Descartes begins his philosophy from a perspective of skepticism, right? He starts his philosophy by starting with doubt and saying, how do I know that anything exists at all? And what he's looking for is some kind of clear, rational anchor that he can tie his philosophy to. So he starts with skepticism and looks for some kind of absolutely provable starting point for his philosophy that he needs to build off of. So there needs to be something rationally demonstrable to begin. And for Descartes, that is the existence of the self. So we have the famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. In many ways, he's really saying, I doubt, therefore I am, because he's doubting his existence. And he says, well, at least if I'm doubting my existence, the one thing I can know is there has to be a self that's doubting. That's going to be even challenged by Hume. But that leads to rationalism, where people are trying to find the incontrovertible truths, like the things that you can't argue against. What are the sure, basic, rational assumptions that we can come to as a starting point for our knowledge about the world? Then you have another movement which is largely in Britain, and that is the movement known as empiricism. So when we're talking about things that are empirical, we're talking about knowledge that is gained through experience. So the knowledge that is gained as you encounter objects in the world. So instead of locating everything in the mind, right, or the kind of maybe logical formulations that you come up with, or the idealist perspectives, idealism being the belief that ideas are the ultimate reality. So Kant is really the founder of German idealism. He creates this new or transcendental idealism, this new school of idealism. But classically, we're thinking of someone like Plato, who says the ideas are the most real and the physical things of this world are less real. The empiricists push very strongly against that and say the foundation of knowledge is experience. All knowledge that I have is by means of my experience. So this is famously put together by John Locke, for example, who says that the mind is a tabula rasa, right? The mind is just a blank slate. There are no preconceived ideas in the mind at all. We just gain knowledge through our experiences. So our mind is formed as we experience various things. Now, this has been significantly challenged through the studies of psychology, especially childhood psychology and childhood development. These things have also been challenged as people have discovered the differences in just basic categories that exist between people groups, especially tribes that have had no connection to the Western world and the categories and concepts that we use. So there's challenge to all of these ideas in various ways as we enter into the modern world. But empiricism, the three major figures of empiricism are Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. So people are going to often say the empiricists, those are the three figures that they usually mean. And they're often treated together. But they are still quite different thinkers. Hume is kind of the ultimate skeptic. And John Locke becomes highly influential for the development of liberalism in political philosophy. All right, so something else that is important to understand Kant and his background and what he's responding to is a kind of moral relativism. And the moral relativism that we see most clear is in someone like David Hume. And so this shows up within the empiricist tradition, but especially in David Hume, where David Hume says we don't really have access to some kind of objective moral system that we can simply trust and say we know this or that is right. Now, as there is an increasing skepticism towards religion and its place in society, a kind of divine command theory, perhaps, of morality is going to be rejected. The notion that we have these objective divine commands that God has given us through his word, and that is the foundation of morality. There also is a rejection of the natural law theory, which tends to be the predominant theory within Christian history of morality. And that is rejected as well. So someone like Hume says, basically, well, there really isn't a ground for morality. It all is kind of based on feeling. So there is a shift from reason being used to make moral judgments to then reason being used instrumentally. So we call instrumental reason. Now, instrumental reason is reason as it is used. You basically make a decision of, I want to do X, Y, or Z, and now you use your reason to figure out how am I going to get to point, X, Y, or Z. So your reason is used not to find objective moral conclusions, but simply to come to decisions of how you can do the things that you want to do. There is also at this time, through the rise of modern philosophy, the assumption of nominalism. We're going to see that strongly in Kant. By nominalism, I mean the distinction between nominalism and realism that is a major debating point in the Middle Ages, and nominalism ends up triumphing in modern philosophy. So to quickly explain that, and I have plenty of videos explaining these issues. If you look at my History of Western Thought series, you can get some more detail there. But so briefly, realism is the idea that essences actually exist. And that when I say, the example I use is usually like a dog or a tree, but so we'll use one of those, right? So that when I see a dog, I recognize that there is such a real thing as a dog, and I see individual dogs and that may be very different breeds. And if you look at different breeds of dogs, they can look very different. They can act very different. Their behavior can be very different. But I'm still using a general category to describe all of those particular dogs. So the question is, well, what makes all the individual particulars a dog? What is it that makes us use that term to define all of these things? The realist says because a dog is a thing that actually exists. And all of those particular dogs share in this broader concept of dogness, right? So a dog is whatever shares in dogness. And we can do that with trees or people or whatever. But the idea is that the thing that is a dog is actually real. So when I encounter objects in the world, I am encountering them as real essences that my mind actually grasps and has a knowledge of. The other perspective of nominalism says, well, no, there isn't really such a thing as, say, a dog or whatever category you want to use, thing you want to be talking about here. But instead, you are simply using categories to identify individual particular things as unified objects. So there is no such thing as an essence of what a dog is. Rather, we simply, either in our minds or by our use of language, so there are different approaches to nominalism, but say that we basically impose our concepts upon the world around us. So instead of taking the concepts from the world, say of a dog, instead the concept comes from me or from society or from my brain, and now I impose that upon the world itself. So I create category of dog to say, I'm going to call things that do this dog, and therefore the unity between particular dogs into one species of dog is really just a product of the human mind, not something that really exists within the dogs themselves. So it's a question of, are we subjects who are in a world that we can actually grasp and receive reality from our sense experience and our reason? Or is it that we go into the world and we impose our own categories upon the world? So kind of which way does this go? That's a brief explanation and probably an inadequate one, but I got to move on. So there is an assumption of the nominalist position at this time. That's really assumed by all individuals from, rationalist, empiricist perspectives. They're all nominalists. They all reject the classical, more Platonic or Aristotelian view of reality. There is a shift in philosophy from questions of metaphysics, questions of being, to questions of epistemology or questions of knowledge. So with Descartes, you have a shift to a position of doubt as a starting point for philosophy. And now this raises all sorts of questions of how do I know that anything exists at all? So that becomes a major concern of philosophers of this era. And if you look at, say, the ancient Greeks or the medieval Christian tradition, it's the assumption that, well, of course, we can know what exists. There are different theories of knowledge, for sure, but everybody's pretty agreed that our brains are generally pretty reliable. Like our experience is generally pretty reliable in terms of what we encounter. We have some kind of real connection between nature and what's in my head. And some of that is this idea of essences, because if things partake of an essence, and an essence is essentially an idea, and I have ideas that are in my head, that means there's something in the objects around me that are also in my head, so that there's this connecting point. So once you get rid of that, now it's a question of, well, I'm just imposing categories on the world, so how do I know that I understand the world at all? How do I know my categories are right? Is there a way to know that the categories are right? Is there a way to know that the world actually exists apart from me? Or maybe it's just all my own experience of the world, and there is no objective world? Those are the kinds of questions people are asking at this point. So Immanuel Kant is basically a rationalist in the beginnings of his philosophical career, and at some point there is this massive shift, and that is through his reading of David Hume, where he speaks about famously his dogmatic slumber. He's awakened from his dogmatic slumber. So here's the quote. He says, "I freely admit that the remembrance of David Hume was the very thing that many years ago first interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave a completely different direction to my researches in the field of speculative philosophy." So David Hume comes from a perspective of almost an absolute skepticism. I mean, he's kind of the arch skeptic of this time period. And he starts to really challenge the optimism of the rationalist, to say we can really know so much about the world just by use of our reason. And Hume kind of pokes holes in a lot of their arguments and tries to make the claim that essentially we don't really know anything at all. We don't really know that the objective world exists. We don't have any objective access to morality. And as Kant, and there's debate about when this experience actually happens, but there are two different points in Kant's career, and it's really after this that he makes his most influential contributions. But at this point, Kant reads this, and now he's asking very different questions. And he describes a period of 11 years of just wrestling with Hume's philosophy. Specifically, I believe it was Hume's treatise on human nature, which would also be worthwhile to delve into, because that's a very influential text. And so that really shapes then where Kant is going to go. So there are some categories that we really have to understand to get what Kant is talking about here. And so this background, and I know it's been a lot of time on background, but you got to get the background to really know what Kant is trying to say. And Kant says so much that it is really difficult to summarize his thoughts in a brief lecture. So I'm trying the best I can here to make this understandable, because it can be quite complex. If you read the Critique of Pure Reason, I mean, it's like 800 something pages, and it is not easy to follow at all. It's a difficult work, which is probably honestly why Kant was not initially an influential figure, because I think people had a hard time even getting through the book. It's very convoluted. But there is a very rational argument underneath it. Not convoluted in the sense of, reading Heidegger. That's a different beast. So here are some categories you've got to understand to know the basics of what Kant is doing in his philosophy. One is you have to understand the distinction between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. If you don't get this, you don't get Kant. So a priori knowledge is knowledge that is prior to or independent of your experience. Now, when I say prior to, I don't actually mean prior to in the temporal sense. But it's not derivative from experience. There's certain knowledge, Kant is going to argue, that is gained that is not just dependent upon your experience of this or that. These are what he calls universal truths and necessary truths. So these are truths that are true at all times and in all places. He's going to do this, we're going to see, with his moral philosophy. And we'll explain this a little more as we move on. But there are also things that are necessary, not things that are contingent. So, for example, if I look around my office and I see a bunch of books, if it was the case that every single book in my office was the color red, which would be kind of weird, but say it was, if that was the case, I could say, hey, every book in my office is red. That would be a true statement. However, that would not be a necessary statement. In other words, there is no necessity that every book in my office is read or must be read. It's just merely the fact that every book is read. But it very well could be the case that I buy a blue book and stick it on my shelf, and now the statement is no longer true. So you see, that's not a universal statement that every book in my office is read, because it could easily be changed at any point. It's not a universal law. And it's also not necessary, because it could change easily. So those things would be a posteriori judgments. So a posteriori knowledge is that which is derived from experience and dependent upon experience. And so this is knowledge that is contingent. It is dependent. It is not necessary, right? So my having, say, only read books in my library would not be out of necessity, but it would be contingent upon my buying and sticking read books on my bookcases, and contingent upon me then not buying non-read books in the future to put on my bookcases. And it is also particular, right? If I'm making a statement about the nature of the books that I have, it's dependent upon what's in my office. This is my unique individual office. It's not making a claim about the nature of everybody's offices in general. And so a priori knowledge is that which is universal. So we're going to be seeing that Kant largely talks about mathematical formulations. He's going to say that mathematics and geometry, those things are universal. Even the laws of physics, we're talking about universal laws. We're talking about something beyond just what happens to be the case here and now. Because someone like David Hume is going to question whether there really are universal laws at all. Think about it. Let's just take a statement to see how this works. If I were to say unicorns are not real, you probably take that as a true statement. But in the truest sense, is that really, is that an a priori statement? Is that something that I can really say I know is the fact universally? Well, no. How could I actually make a universal statement that unicorns don't exist? Well, the only way that I could possibly do that is if I was in every place in the universe at the same time, because maybe there is another galaxy somewhere where there's a planet full of unicorns. Do I know that? Of course I don't know that. In order to know that, I'd have to see every place. Now, even if I went to see every single place in the universe, as impossible as that would be, I still wouldn't know if there were no unicorns, because it could be the case that when I left, right after I left the Earth and started visiting other planets, a unicorn popped up on Earth. Or even if I was able to see all places at the same time, what if there was a unicorn that existed in the past? Or what if there was a unicorn that will exist in the future? Right? You can't make a universal statement about that because it's dependent upon your experience. So you can make, general judgments. I don't think they exist, or I've never experienced them, but you're not making an absolute universal claim about the existence of unicorns. Okay, so rational truths. Rational truths are known a priori. Okay, so rational truths are known a priori. And what Kant is going to say is that we need to prioritize those judgments that are not dependent upon your experience, because those things which are dependent upon experience are contingent. They can change. And in response to Hume, though, he's saying, but there is this knowledge that we really can know. So there is something that we can know. He also says that there are some categories. He's going to say that there are these mental categories that are not derived from experience at all, but we have these mental categories that we then use as means by which we understand our experience. And so he's going to speak about space and time as two of those categories. And so when we're looking at things as they happen temporally, you can ask the question, well, how do we make sense of one event happening in another event? How do we make sense of the various events that we encounter in our lives? He's going to say, well, we have this preconceived concept of time that's a structure in the mind that's really we bring to our experience. So they're not derived from experience. He's going to, unlike the empiricist who will say everything is derived from experience, he's saying, no, these are structures of in the mind that then is used to organize our experience. So he's going to talk about the preconditions of knowledge, the intellectual preconditions of knowledge that we gain through the world. And the other is space. And so how do we make sense of objects around us? Well, we have a category of space, and our brain just kind of puts object within this category of space so that we can make sense of the world around us. So we have these kind of presuppositions, we may say, of the existence of space and time that we bring, or our minds, our intellect brings to our experience of the world. This does not mean for Kant, however, that space and time actually exist objectively. And this is going to be one of the problems we find in Kant, is that he does talk about transcendentals. He talks about that which really does exist outside of our experience, but we're still only talking about those things not as things objectively as they are, but things that exist in our mind. So that which is transcendental are things that are beyond individual experience that we know a priori, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they actually exist in themselves. And that's going to be a major problem for Kant that I don't think Kant really overcomes. So then you also need to understand another category that Kant makes, category distinction that he makes, and that is between analytic and synthetic judgments. So an analytic judgment is a judgment that is made from the data within the thing itself. So you don't need anything, apart from, say, the definition of what a thing is. You don't need to add anything additional to it in order to make a judgment. So the classic example that everybody uses here is all bachelors are unmarried men. Right? You're not bringing together two different ideas to come to the conclusion that all bachelors are unmarried men. All you need is the definition of bachelor to say that is what a bachelor is. That's an analytic judgment. You're saying what the thing is in itself, like by itself, not really in itself, because there is no thing in itself. But that can be known. But that's another question. So, but you see how you're just making a judgment based on the fact of what a bachelor is. But then take mathematics. I just got a basic math problem here. The one that he uses is I think 7 plus 5 equals 12. But I did a multiplication problem, right? So whatever. So 5 times 3 equals 15. And the point is, you couldn't get 15 out of just the concept of 5. You couldn't get 15 out of just the concept of 3 by itself. You have to add these two concepts together. And in adding these two concepts together through multiplication, now you can come to the conclusion of 15. So that's a synthetic judgment. What Kant is going to argue is that there are not just analytic a priori judgments, but also synthetic a priori judgments. So he is going to say that those truths that we know apart from experience or independent of our experience, that are not dependent upon my sense experience in the world, we can actually make conclusions by grabbing a bunch of these a priori realities and putting them together. So he's trying to refute the strong skepticism that we see in a lot of the empiricists. In a lot of ways, he's really combining the empiricist and rationalist traditions. And the question of whether he does that well in a way that's satisfying is one that's been asked and answered in many different ways. But that's what he's trying to do here. So he's trying to say we can make these synthetic a priori judgments. We can take the data that we have that is not derived from experience, and we can add that data together in all sorts of ways and come to a lot of conclusions about what is universally true and what is necessary. Largely, he's going to be speaking about mathematical truths. Some of this is metaphysical, but as also we'll discuss, he kind of recovers metaphysics in some way in terms of its existence, but he's also going to say we can't really know what the thing in itself is. But those truths are transcendental, meaning they transcend just us. It's not just me. There are universal truths. So Kant is trying to grab onto a notion of universal truth. He doesn't really want to just dive into a total skepticism. I don't think he really ever escapes the trap of skepticism, because we still have the question of, well, what are those universal truths, the mathematical truths? Is that just through the concepts in the mind, or they have objective existence outside of us? And I don't think he ever really comes to that latter conclusion. By the way, I do have to say, though, that there are a lot of interpretations of Kant. Any of these major figures in philosophy, just like in theology, people are going to interpret them in different ways. So you have a lot of different schools of thought that interpret Kant in various ways after Kant. And some of that is that Kant's writing is difficult. So it's not always exactly clear. So there are ones that move more toward a kind of objective understanding of the world in Kant, and others that are much more kind of subjectivist. But I don't see a real transcendental objectivity in Kant. I think it's really only mental. Okay. So then we have those categories are the first categories we need to understand. And then we have this other category of other distinction between two categories of the noumenal and the phenomenal. And this is very much related to what we just talked about with a priori and a posteriori. Okay, so the noumenal. There are these two kind of realms of existence. There's the noumenal realm and the phenomenal. The noumenal is the thing in itself, the Ding an sich, as he calls it. And the Ding an sich is the essence of a thing, what a thing really is apart from my experience of it. So we're talking about something like the Platonic essences. So we'll say what a tree is or what a dog is. Those are the things in themselves. Now, that's distinguished. What the thing is in itself, the Ding an sich, is distinct from the phenomenal, which is not the thing as it is in itself, but the thing as it appears to me by means of my sense experience. So that is my experience with, I can pet the dog, and I could talk about how the dog sounds when it barks to me, like how I register the sound, or how the fur feels on my hand, or how bad the dog smells. I'm talking about how it affects my personal experience, because I'm talking about how I sense the dog, how I encounter it. So that's the phenomenal realm. So in some ways, Kant is restructuring and reviving Plato's distinction between these two realms. So for Plato, in Platonic dualism, you have the realm of the forms, which is the realm of ideas, which is distinct from the realm of experience. And the realm of the forms, these are universal truths that are always true. So we have the same kind of idea you have in Kant, that there are these things that are universal, that are not just particular. And they are not contingent truths, they're just true no matter what. And for Plato, those are the ultimate realities. That's the highest reality, is these unchanging ideas, or the forms. And then for Plato, in our experience, we encounter the world, but what we encounter are really shadows, not the real thing or the thing in itself, but we can grasp the thing in itself through our experience with individual things. But in our experience, we don't encounter so much the universal, but we encounter the particular. We don't encounter that which is totally non-contingent, but that which is contingent. But for Plato, we can reason, like our minds actually function to grasp real reality, so we can reason from the particular to the universal. So we encounter the world through the phenomenal, and that's not Plato's language, this is Kant's language, but through that, we can reason to the noumenal. We can really understand reality as it is. But here's where Kant strongly differs from Plato. Because for Kant, the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, is not actually knowable. So it's as if he understands and believes in the Platonic realm of the forms, but ultimately says, we can't know what the forms actually are. So all we have is our knowledge of our experience. So the noumenal realm, the things as they actually are, we don't actually have access to. All I know is my personal experience and how I encounter the world. And that's the phenomena. So all we know is the phenomena. And you see how this leads to skepticism about the natural world. And a lot of thinkers are going to go far beyond Kant in the realm of skepticism of the existence of the natural world. Because Kant doesn't really have the tools to argue against that. Because eventually, here's the thing, Kant believes that the noumenal realm exists. He believes that the thing in itself exists, what we may call the Platonic realm of the forms. He believes it exists, but he doesn't think we have really access to it, so we can't really know what it is. Well, thinkers are pretty quickly, especially who are called phenomenologists, people are pretty quickly going to say, well, if we don't have access to the noumenal realm, how do we know it exists at all? Maybe all that exists is phenomena. Maybe there is no thing in itself. There is no kind of objective world at all. There's just what I encounter through my sense experience. And I don't think Kant has a real strong way to argue against that. Now, that's going to be a quick, that criticism is going to show up very quickly. And some people are going to grab onto that and say, we don't know that the objective world exists at all. Something else I think that is key, and we could get into this more if we do something on Hume. This is really key for a lot of the development of modern philosophy and its departure from earlier Christian philosophy, is the acceptance of Hume's rejection of Aristotelian causality. So, and I don't want to I just don't have the time to get too into Aristotle's view of causality. I have a whole view on Aristotle on the causes. It's a short video if you want to watch that, which is in our History of Western Thought series if you want a background to that. So I'll point you there if you want to get the background there. But Hume basically rejects Aristotle's idea of causality. And in doing that, he says we don't really know what causes what. all we really know is that in our experience, we tend to see one thing happening after another. And we just kind of reason from that those things are probably causally connected, right? So if I, if I throw my glass on the floor, it is probably going to fall and shatter if I throw it hard enough. Well, how do I know that? I know that because my experience has shown me that when I drop a glass hard enough that it tends to fall and tends to shatter. Well, what's the cause of what? What's the cause of the glass shattering? Hume would say, all we really have is sense impressions, that this tends to be the case in our experience, but we can't even make a universal judgment about that. I can't universally say that every glass shatters when it hits the floor, because there's no inherent anything in the thing itself that causes it to shatter. It's just what tends to happen in my experience. But we have all these assumptions, like we assume that the past is going to be like, or the future is going to be like the past. So we assume that because it's happened in the past, it can happen in the future. Do we really know that? This is the kind of skepticism that Kant is trying to challenge with his system. But he doesn't fundamentally disagree with the inner workings of Hume's approach to causality, which an Aristotelian view would say that there actually is something within the object itself as an essence that means that it tends toward this end, so that there is something actual inherent about the object, that there are things that it does or doesn't do depending on what acts on it or what doesn't, that we actually have access to. But if you don't have access to the noumenal realm, you can't make those kind of claims. So all we can say in terms of causality is, I see this tends to happen in my own experience. Okay, this all that we've talked about at this point has been described by Kant himself as the Copernican Revolution in philosophy. I'm going to say that I actually don't know that it's a Copernican revolution and it is a revolutionary idea, because I think it's just a kind of repackaged nominalism. Sure, it's a more sophisticated nominalism. I mean, there were plenty of sophisticated nominalists in the Middle Ages too, but it's a different form of nominalism. Kant's, brilliance or genius is certainly not in question by any means. I don't know anybody who would doubt his genius, but the solution is, I don't think as original as he seems to think that it is. So the Copernican Revolution, we're talking about, Copernicus and, of course, famously Copernicus changed the views of people in the world surrounding whether the Earth revolves around the sun and the sun revolves around the Earth. So the point is, we had gotten things totally backwards in terms of what revolved around what. Right? Because it looks to us like the sun revolves around the Earth, so we just assume that's the case. In reality, it's the case that the Earth revolves around the sun. There's this Copernican revolution in the sciences, in astronomy. So it's the opposite of what we had previously believed. Now, Kant says this same exact thing is happening in philosophy, and it's due to him. So he sees himself as this kind of Copernican figure. And he's not wrong in that this is a major, major shift in philosophy. So this is maybe the most influential idea that we do see in Kant. So he's not wrong in terms of what its impact on philosophy was going to be. I just don't know that it's quite as original as he tends to think. Okay, so what Kant does is he reverses the order of subject and object. So generally, we are going to say that the objects that exist in the world that we encounter, those are objective realities that we see and we experience around us. And I, as the subject, I am changed as I encounter them. My mind changes. I change in terms of how I perceive things and how I think about the world, but the world objectively is the case, as it is. Kant is going to say that that's totally backwards. Instead, objects themselves that we encounter, we're talking about phenomena here, because we don't have access to the thing in itself, but phenomena, the objects are actually affected by human cognition. So they are really interpreted through our own brains and our own mindsets, our own perspectives of things like space and time, these transcendentals. So the order is reversed. It is the subject, in the mind of the subject, really interpreting and changing the world around it, rather than the opposite, where we are simply receivers of an external objective world that we have access to. So we bring universality and necessity into the world of objects. And that's why I say that I don't think Kant is really speaking about these as objective realities. He's just saying these are concepts of the mind. And we bring those concepts of the mind and import them into the phenomena. So we bring our own concepts, and these are not conscious things, by the way. These are pre-conscious. So these even precede consciousness. So it's not like we're actively trying to think through what space is or what time is and then import that. He's saying these are just kind of structures of thought that exist underneath consciousness itself. So we are bringing that to the objects around us. So all objects that we know, all the phenomena that we know, is known through these categories of precognition. But he's also going to challenge what the subject is. I mean, he seems to say that subjects, too, are just kind of appearances. Because if we're talking about the thing in itself, what can be known, Kant is going to challenge whether we can even know ourselves either. So at times he's going to speak of the self, and certainly in transcendental terms, that there is this transcendent, coherent, consistent self. But at other times, because he does not believe in the reality of the thing itself as something we can know, all we really know is the appearances that we exist as a unified subject. We don't actually know that. I don't know that I am a unified object or unified person. All I know is that my experiences appear to make the most sense that way. So we do have these kind of transcendental categories of the existence of the self, but all that is a kind of transcendental category that's part of my cognition or precognition. Not that it is something that actually objectively exists in the real world. This then shows up in Kant's moral philosophy. So Kant's moral philosophy is really a direct outgrowth of what we've already talked about here as we've laid the groundwork. So, I could do a whole program on Kant's moral philosophy. I'm just going to do a quick summarization because the previous ideas are really what I wanted to focus on, but I want to talk quickly about how this affects his view of other things. So we'll look at this and then moral philosophy and religion. Okay, so moral philosophy. Kant doesn't want to say that morality is just purely subjective, which is what Hume does. Okay, so Hume, again, just says reason really serves only in an instrumental capacity. We don't really use reason to come to kind of objective moral conclusions about the world or about reality, what we should or shouldn't do. The question of oughts. That's not objectivity. That's just really a result of personal feeling and bias. Kant rejects that. And I think most of us would reject that, right? I mean, something in us knows that that's not right. There's got to be something that beyond just personal feeling in terms of morality. And even when people say that, it's pretty clear that they don't really believe that. They don't act in such a way that that's the case. Now, I would certainly say as a Christian that this is just the result of the law that's written on the heart. So I would say that this is just how God has created us, that we have a moral sense that we really can't escape, which is why we don't find a conclusion like Hume's to be intellectually satisfactory. We know that it's not. It's something even deeply ingrained within us knows that there are moral judgments. There are moral judgments that are more objective than just I feel something or you feel something. All right, so for Kant, he's going to take the same kind of qualifications that he makes for these kind of a priori judgments, or what he talks about as the transcendentals, and say this is the case with morality. So he's going to say that morality itself must be something that is universal. So we can't have a morality that's based purely on individuality. We can't just take things on a case-by-case basis as someone like Hume wants to do. Well, why is that? Well, this is logical. There's certainly a bit of logic to what Kant says here. When you do something wrong, morally wrong, it tends to be the case that you like to make an excuse for what you do. We all do this. Right? We say, well, something that we may think is wrong in some circumstances, we may, in some unique circumstance, say, well, but it's okay if I do it because X, Y, and Z. We love making excuses. People are great at making excuses to do what they want to do. And if there's an exception to the general moral rule, the exception is always you, and it's always when you happen to want to do something. You can always find an excuse to make an exception. And Kant recognizes this about us. That's just what we do as people. So it can't just be contingent situation by situation. There has to be something universal or transcendent about morality. So morality cannot be a posteriori. So morality cannot just be derived from my experience. This thing happened to work well and seem right in this circumstance, or that thing may have seemed right in that circumstance. So it has to be something beyond that. So what he creates is what's known as the categorical imperative, that moral decisions must be timeless and universal. Just like the a priori in general, it has to be timeless and universal. So we're making timeless, universal judgments about the world. So there's a connection between his approach to mathematics and his approach to morality. It's essentially the same in that these are things that apply at all times and all places. It doesn't differ. It's not contingent depending on where I am or what time I'm living in or what society I'm a part of or what I ate for breakfast this morning. Kant is also going to say good actions arise from an internal goodwill. You see in Kant a focus on the will and personal freedom. And he's going to do this in response to what I talked about before, which is this total mechanistic view of the world and mechanistic view of humanity. And so he doesn't want to fall into this trap of just seeing the self as purely a machine and you just kind of do what you do and you have no human freedom or responsibility. Kant reacts very strongly against that. So he's going to say that good moral actions are not just about the outward act, but they have their root in inner freedom, right? The inner goodwill. So he's affirming human freedom in response to mechanistic determinism. At least the appearance of human freedom. Because again, we don't know the thing in itself. There's also an equation between freedom and rationality that you see in Enlightenment thinkers, that you see in Kant, and many others at this time. And that is to act the most freely is to act according to reason. So the most free actions are the most rational actions. And the more rational you are, the more free you are. The more free you are, the more rational you are. Kant argues in ethics that we need to speak not just about means, okay, as instrumental reason would do with morality, like with Hume. Instead, we speak about moral ends. Particularly, he says that humans must be treated as ends rather than means. So, unlike Hume, we don't just say, oh, I want to get what I want, and I can use you to get what I want, because practically maybe that's the case. But Kant says, no, our moral judgments cannot work in that way. We have to treat people as actual human beings. They are ends. They are goals in and of themselves. They are not just something that we use to get what we want. His moral philosophy is also centered on the concept of duty. So he speaks about our duty to obey the moral laws. This is what's right universally, and you as a human being have a duty to do what is right. So this is going to be distinct from a natural law perspective. Okay, then I want to talk here about his views of religion. And Kant has been seen in different lights in terms of his views of religion. He is in many ways a critic. He's a critic of Christianity and classical Christianity. Oftentimes he's been seen as kind of an arch critic of religion. But by others, he's been seen as a great defender of religion in a more rationalist context. So I'm certainly going to see him as more of a critic than a defender, but I do think that we have to understand that he saw himself as doing something good in terms of religion in the world. I think. But again, there are different interpretations of that. So I think a lot of his criticism is really going to be criticism that is in some ways rooted in his pietist background. Because remember, the pietists at this time do not emphasize the objective character of revelation so much as they do the internal character. Or we could say the phenomenal realities of religion, what it makes us feel. He rejects traditional arguments for God's existence. So the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas, for example, which say that we can actually have objective knowledge of God's existence. Kant is going to say, no, we actually don't have any real knowledge of God's existence. We have a kind of assumed knowledge of God's existence. He does see God's existence as a kind of precondition of action in the world. So he is going to see that religion particularly helps us in making moral judgments and moral decisions. That it's a helpful framework. It's a framework that is, again, a framework of precognition that's there because it helps us to see that, hey, we're rewarded if we do good, we're punished if we do bad in an afterlife, and that helps us to do good things. He would say the same thing about the immortality of the soul. It is one of these transcendental ideas. Doesn't mean it has objective validity, though, but it is an idea that we bring into our experience. And he's going to say that about human freedom as well. So he's going to say religion is good, and it has it's an assumption that we have that God exists and that the soul is immortal, and it meets the needs of practical reason. So really, morality becomes the purpose of religion. Internal experience and morality. And as you look at the birth of Protestant liberalism, you see an emphasis on both of those things. So if you look at the two most significant figures arising from Protestant liberalism, you have Albert Ritschl, who basically is a moralist Kantian. And then we have Schleiermacher, Friedrich Schleiermacher, who comes first, but he is more speaks about internal experience and internal feeling. And these both in some ways arise from what Kant does with Christianity. God as he is in himself cannot be known for Kant, because that's noumena. So we don't really have any knowledge of his actual existence. We have knowledge of how we feel religiously at different points in time, say a conversion experience, but we don't really have objective knowledge of his existence. And then as he's also a critic of ritual and hierarchy in religion. That's where we really see his pietism and his pietist background coming out. Ritual is not good because everything is focused on the inner goodwill, which is very pietistic. So everything is about what's happening inside. So hierarchy, ritual, that all is not authentic. That is not freedom. Those things are kind of baggage that religion should get rid of. And then finally, he's going to say there's no natural theology. So we can't derive anything objectively about what objectively exists from our observations and study of the natural world. Whether that's, morality or the existence of God and God's attributes. So Kant's influence, finally, as we end here, let's just quickly go over what does Kant impact in terms of the development of philosophy and theology and all other schools of all other disciplines after this point. Well, Kant really is the most central figure of the Enlightenment. I think he is the most, and I say he's the most important philosopher of the modern world, and I stand by that statement. And it's a bold statement, but Kant is so influential for everyone that comes afterwards. I mean, we could talk, sure, about Descartes, and Descartes kind of started things rolling. He's the birth of modern philosophy. But in Kant, we have the flowering of what was in Descartes. We have the most comprehensive system that attempts to bring all strains of thought of modern philosophy together. So he tries to bring out elements of rationalism and empiricism. He tries to bring Newtonian physics into his philosophy in a way that it's coherent, but also tries to explain the usefulness of religion. And then his aesthetic theory, we haven't even touched on, but in his aesthetic theory, he talks about the role and purpose of art. So everything really culminates in Kant. He brings everything systematically together that no other thinker does, until Hegel. I don't think Hegel does it as well as Kant, but Hegel is pretty comprehensive. Now, I reject both of their ideas, so because I'm not in favor of the entire project of modern philosophy. But and I think that Descartes starts some things on the wrong foot. So he then is the basis for German idealism. So when people talk about German idealism, they're starting with Kant. Hegel is the next major iteration of that. And those two figures, Hegel and Kant, continue to be the most significant ones today. He does bring about the reemergence of the concept of transcendence in philosophy. So he's trying to go beyond just the empirical. But the challenge is, does he really prove that the transcendent actually exists? Or is it just transcendence in some precognition sense that doesn't speak to objective reality as it is? And I think the latter is the case. But I think we can at least say that Kant gives an attempt to really speak about transcendence and the necessity of the transcendent. It really brings about moralistic deism. And he brings moralistic deism into theology. And he brings rationalism into theology. And so Protestant liberalism has not yet started at this point officially. Generally, we'd say that the beginnings of Protestant liberalism are with Schleiermacher's publication in 1799, Speeches on Religion to its Cultured Despisers. But none of that really would have happened without Kant. Like, Kant sets the framework for a religion a Christianity that says morality is the point. God may not actually be involved in the world, especially not through the supernatural, the miraculous, and that reason plays a central role in determining what things we accept as true in terms of supernatural revelation and what we don't. So these things start to infiltrate theology, and you can't understand those developments without grasping Kant's influence. Kant also makes duty the framework for morality. So every moral system from Kant onward deals with his approach, a deontology, as it's often referred to. So every ethicist deals with deontology. Now, there are problems with deontologies that people have recognized. Like, because there are circumstances where it seems like something that generally would be conceived of as pretty universal doesn't appear to be a universal rule. So the classic example that people give is if you're, during the Holocaust, if you're hiding, say, a Jew in your home, and, the Nazi soldier comes to your door and says, "Are you hiding a Jew in this house?" And say, if you say yes, they're going to be sent to the gas chambers to be killed, likely. Or, if you say no, you're lying, but you're protecting somebody's life. And the question is, does Kant's idea of universality in morality, how does it answer those questions in circumstances like that? Because it would seem to be the case that if it's morally wrong to lie, which Kant would say it is, and I think we should say it is, well, what about a circumstance like that? Do you just lie anyway, even though it has the consequence of someone maybe dying for the sake of this lie? And I think most of us recognize that there have to be some exceptions, which Kant doesn't really leave room for. But that's his major contribution to moral philosophy. Kant also defines the centrality of the human will inwardly and of personal freedom. And that's not unique with Kant. It's not like he's the first one to talk about freedom. We see this a lot with Locke as well, and many others. But he solidifies that tradition within the West in many ways. And so those are just some of the ways that Kant is influential. He's influential in, as I said, nearly every area. Well, I hope you found this helpful. He is a kind of tough figure to explain briefly, and I really hope that I tried to make this as easy as I could to explain the ideas of Kant. So let me know what you thought and if you're able to follow this. Let me know if there are other figures you would like me to delve into in this series, and hope you continue to watch. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't yet. And we'll see you in the next one. God bless.